uh, next month. Oh, that date is wrong. It's not June 6th. It's going to be June 20th, Monday, June 20th. 1 month from today, Mirzad Barghouti will be talking about the Iran nuclear deal. And with a little bit of luck, in July, we'll have one of these people who I've mentioned talking about the Shireen's execution and the IDF attack on a funeral and related issues. So let's get back to start the talk with Jeff Cooper. I don't, the audience are full of people who are either friends directly of Jeff's or regular members here. So I don't have to introduce Jeff very much. Jeff, I'll just say he lived and worked in Ramallah. He lived in Ramallah and worked in the whole West Bank for about 3 years in the early 90s during the first Intifada.
And the Gaza Strip.
And the Gaza Strip.
Right, Yasmin?
I'm going to just stop and turn the floor over to Jeff.
Oh, man. So what, was it, Dick, you don't want me to read, huh? Was it, that was Dick's voice I heard, right?
Yeah, it was. Keep it open in front of you and just flip as you see something.
Oh, man. Well, okay. You know, maybe I can relax a little by talking about the first couple of days when I was there, and then tell you how I got there. And so I'll start doing that. Maybe I'll relax that way, because I'm really, really tense. I've never been this tense in my life. My first day in Ramallah, when I got to Ramallah, this was in the beginning of June 1990. I had been there in 1989. I'll talk about that when I talk about how I got there. But my first day in Ramallah, my house wasn't ready to move into. So I was placed in a house across the street from the Quaker school where I worked for 3.5 years. They owned that property, and there was a 2-story house there. And one of the teachers from the school, who happened to be a U.S. expat, was living there with his children. His wife had passed away. Anyway, he and I had lunch on his veranda. And this was my first afternoon. I had just gotten there in the morning, and this was the afternoon. And we're having lunch on his veranda, looking out towards the friend school. And we see this kid jump over a wall. And right after him is a settler with an Uzi. And he's chasing this kid down. When he catches, and the kid must have been about 9 or 10 years old. And he starts beating the shit out of this kid. I mean, just beating him horribly. So Don and I jumped up and started yelling, you know, at the settler, saying, you know, what's going on? You know, what? Stop beating this child. He whipped his Uzi around, pointed at us, and said, "Stay out of this, or I'll kill you right now." Something to that effect. And then he grabbed the kid and took him away. And I don't know whatever happened to the kid. Okay, that's my first day there. The next morning, I got up early, and we moved. I had very little luggage, so we moved to where I lived for the next 3.5 years. It was down in the old part of Ramallah, and it was an area where people were pretty much low income and working class, and that's where I made my friends, because during the Intifada there was almost no social life. If you had a social life before, you know, you could carry that on, but I didn't know anybody. And the way things were, from 1 o'clock on every day, there was a strike where they initiated by the leadership of the Intifada throughout the occupied territories. And so everything shut down. Ramallah became a ghost town. Villages became ghost towns. I assume I wasn't in the other villages, but every day, everything shut down. Everybody went home and stayed in their homes until the next morning. And the only people that were out on the streets were the military. either in Jeeps and lorries driving around all day long, or on foot patrols. And if they caught you outside, they would push you up against the wall, search you, might hit you a little, and want to know what you're doing. And so people just stayed in their homes. So there's no social life. My social life was gained by sneaking out in the evenings, sneaking across to the man who I very closely befriended, someone who was pretty close to me in age. He had about 5 or 6 children. He owned a store with chickens. He sold live chickens. Well, he would take the chickens and kill them and feather them for you and sell them to you. And then I made the other friends I made there were young men who were working class in the immediate neighborhood. So anyway, the next morning I moved into this house, which was right behind the second of the 2 Quaker schools. The first one where I worked at was a high school, essentially. It was from grades 7 through 12, and it was co-ed, but it was called the Friends Boys School. Then I lived right behind what they called the Friends Girls School, which was also co-ed, and that was kindergarten through grade 6. This school was founded in 1869 by Quaker missionaries as a girls' school. So anyway, the second morning I get up, and I did not own a car the whole time I was there, except for the end when I got married and my wife had a car. But I didn't own a car, so I walked everywhere I went. And I told you what happened the first day at lunch. I'm walking to work, and it's about a 10-minute walk from where I live. And I'm walking, going a little uphill, and I see a lorry coming from the other side of the street, but it pulls over because it's coming towards me. So it's on the other side of the street, but it pulls over a little in front of me, maybe about 20 yards in front of me. And this huge soldier jumps out and grabs 2 teenage girls. And he throws him, I guess, in the back of the lorry, and everybody on the street freezes, which has just happened all the time when they grab people or they shoot people in the street in front of you, or they drop percussion grenades, you freeze, or they stop somebody and jack them up. So these 2 girls were thrown. They must have been like 11, 12, or 13. I don't know. All I know is when the lorry started driving on by again, it was covered with canvas, but the back was open. And what I could see, the soldier was just pounding him in there. And what I saw all the time there was when they hit you in your head. They focus on your head. And with girls, they focus on their chest and their head. And with boys, if they get them on the ground, they're always kicking them in the groin as well. But they really go after your head and the upper part of your body. Okay, that was day number 2. So I'm already getting emotional, which is the way I am. Tony, you know that. So the third day, as if the first 2 days weren't enough, the third day, again, I get up in the morning and I do my routine. My routine was to take a bowl and very early in the morning, around 7, and go to a shop where the man sells freshly made hummus, and he puts it in your bowl and then runs olive oil around and puts a little a pickle there. And then I'd walk over to where the bakery was, and you get your pita just coming off of the ovens, and it's just like a big blown up. So you see those fish that are blown up. This is the pita when it comes out of the oven is really big, and then it goes down to where it's flat. Anyway, I'd take it home and eat it with lemon and olives, and then I'd walk to work. So day number 3, I'm walking up to work, and I've got some here. Anyway, I'm walking to work, and this is almost in the same place where the girls were kidnapped and beaten up. And I see quick movement. I'm still not used to what I eventually became used to, which is I was super alert after this day. I mean, I was alert to everything that was around me, consciously alert, because I think it was one person jumped out of a car and assassin executed a young, I think he was a teenager. He must have been 18 or 19. I don't know how, but he shot him to death, maybe 40 feet from me. And I was just, everybody was mesmerized. Everybody just froze. And that guy jumped back into a car and took off. Now he was dressed as a Palestinian, and whether he was Palestinian or not, I'm assuming, because we know, I mean, I know from others later on that these are Israeli executions. Anyway, he was executed right there in the street in front of me. So those are my first 3 days there. And I guess I've gotten into it a little. So now
And you stayed.
What?
And you stayed for another 3 years.
3.5 years, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I was there. I'll tell you that now. I went there, how I got there in 1989. In December of 1989, I had been working for almost 2 years with the Palestine Aid Society in Los Angeles. And they had a delegation that was going to celebrate, I guess, the second anniversary of the beginning of the Intifada. And there were people who came from all over, at least all over Europe and North America. I'm not sure about Asia and the rest of the Middle East, but there were Israeli Jews, Palestinians, and internationals from everywhere. And we actually went and encircled the old city of Jerusalem, the walled city. And his whole idea was for everybody to hold, there was thousands of us holding hands in a peaceful demonstration. And I'll show you, the only photos I really have are the photos from 1989, because all the photos I took when I was working there belonged to the NGO, the project I worked for. So I left everything there, the camera and the photos. So while I was there for 2 weeks, and one day, one of the women in the delegation that I was with, who was a professor at the University of Michigan, said, Jeff, I'm going up to Ramallah. I'm going to interview the principal of the school up there. Do you want to come? And because I'm an educator. So I said, sure. I only thought years later that I think she wanted me to come with her because she went alone. And I think she wanted a male companion. So, which was fine with me because it was the greatest thing that ever happened to me, other than having my children and getting married. Anyway, I went with her, and she interviewed this man named Khalil Mahshi, who doesn't get enough credit for what a great human being he was and all the things that he did when he was alive. He's passed away, sadly, from cancer. And Khalil was a few years younger than me, and I was so blown away by everything he was talking about, because what he was talking about in the interview was changing and developing Palestinian education into an independent force under occupation. He was opposed to the traditional teaching methods. He was opposed to the curriculum. He was he was for a progressive pedagogy, a progressive curriculum. And what he wanted to do was to start a network of educators, Palestinian educators, throughout the occupied territories. And so he had applied. He had written a grant proposal and had written this proposal to an NGO in the Netherlands. And at the end of the interview, I said, I would love to teach here. He said, well, I can't offer you a job. He also said, because right now you're super excited. You're here for 2 weeks and everything is going to excite you. Why don't you go home, and in a couple of months, if you still think you want to work here, write to me. So I said, okay. And 2 months later, I wrote to him. I said, I still want to work for you. And he said, I'm working on a grant proposal. I have nothing open for teaching. And I'll let you know if I get the money. And about a month later, he wrote a beautiful letter to me saying, if you're interested, I'm offering you the job as the director of what would be a Palestinian NGO funded by a Dutch NGO and an NGO called Novib. And so I said, great, like, when do you want me to start? So we said, how about, this was around April. He said, well, just come in as soon as you can. So I said, where I'm teaching, the semester ends right at the end of May. I'll be there at the beginning of June. And that's what I did. I got there in June. My mission, in very simple terms, was to do two things. One, to protect Palestinian education, because the Israelis had closed all of the West Bank K through 12 schools, kindergarten through 12th grade, had closed them completely for about 18 out of the first 21 or 22 months of school. I'm not counting the summers. So my job was to get the word out, to develop a list of contacts all around Europe and North America. And every time that the Israelis did something really bad to Palestinian education, I did press release. I wrote press releases and sent them everywhere. So I had to develop a huge list of contacts, like organizations, activists, professors, people that I knew, also the media, left-wing, media, and that's one of the things I did. So protection was one of our goals. The second goal was to develop, and I use the word in the broadest sense, develop Palestinian education in terms of its pedagogy, introduce progressive pedagogy, introduce a curriculum that was relevant for Palestinians, which was being squashed by the Israeli occupation, and also to network with Palestinian educators all over the occupied territories, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, but also to network the educators themselves with each other. And so that's what I did for 3.5 years. And so I held workshops. I organized, and all this was done illegally, clandestinely. I used to think any day now, I'm going to hear a knock at my door and they are going to arrest me and deport me. And I mean, that fear was with me, that anxiety was with me for 3.5 years. It never went away. And they never came for me. But what I did was to organize the three sectors of education. There was a government school sector, which was directly controlled by Israel, and the UN sector. Israel controlled about directly 78% of the schools. The UN schools were comprised of about 10% of the students, and private schools were about 12%. And so what I did was to try to bring all these people together. So I would hold meetings with teachers, and I always had a translator. I had learned a little bit of Arabic, but not enough. I needed a translator all the time. And the meetings that I held were to allow the teachers that would come to the meetings. Now, it was easy to get UN teachers. It wasn't that easy in the beginning, but UN teachers and private school teachers were not in a position where they would be fired right away for coming to these meetings, even though these meetings were clandestine. And the only people that could be fired were the government school teachers. And they started coming gradually and slowly because, as I said, Israel controlled the entire educational system, and they did the hiring and firing of government school teachers. They outlawed teacher unions, especially in the government schools. And they were really outlawed in the UN and private schools, but the Israelis never really bothered to mess with us.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Jeff. Can you explain why Israel controlled the Palestinian schools?
Why they controlled them? Because part of what I wanted to say at the beginning was the military occupation was an occupation in which Israel controlled all the structures in the West Bank and in Gaza. Okay, so they controlled economic structures, they control the education, and they control the education because they want to control what the Palestinians are getting by way of education. For example, they censored the textbooks for the West Bank were printed in Jordan, only they were censored by Israel. Israel told them anytime in this textbook where the word Palestine is mentioned, take it out and put Israel in. Anytime Palestinians are mentioned, take it out and put in Arabs. The same thing for any maps. So you would not see the word Palestine or Palestinians. And the same thing held in the Gaza Strip for the books, the textbooks that were printed in Egypt. Okay. Now, why do you want to do that? Because you want to have cultural genocide. You don't want to have any, for the Palestinians, you don't want to have them any sense of who they are, okay, of identity. You want to take their identity away completely, okay? And you're only giving them, the only narration you're going to get in these textbooks is the Israeli narration, okay, the Israeli point of view. And if you want to go beyond that, then you're risking your job. Now we did. I see Rory's on here, so we did. My roommate from the second year and third year there is here, and he taught sixth grade. I think it was sixth grade at the schools, and so we in the private schools had a lot more freedom, as long as we didn't overstep, and as long as nobody told the Israelis this is what we were doing. And so what they want to do is keep Palestinians ignorant of their identity. Okay, I mean, I hope that answers your question. And Rory, if you want to.
Yeah, it does answer my question, but it didn't work, did it? Because Palestinians have a very strong identity today.
Yeah, but this is before Oslo, Jeff. I mean, there wasn't a separation. Israel was in control of the whole damn thing.
Israel controlled what was taught, how it was taught, and they controlled all the educational materials. For example, when I was there in 1990, they had already banned 4,000 books and all kinds of literature, educational. I'm talking about educational literature. Okay, and I don't know all the 4,000 books. I'm sure a lot of them were history. But if you want to control people, you got to control their minds, and you want to control their history and their culture. Imagine who you would see yourself as if you didn't know that there was a Holocaust, if you didn't know anything about Yiddish culture or other Jewish cultures around the world. Okay, imagine how you would see yourself. You wouldn't see yourself the same way you see yourself, and how you fit into the world. And I think the ruling class in Israel knew that if you give people knowledge, it opens up their minds, and it also leads to challenging those people, eventually challenging those people that are suppressing them. Now, the Intifada didn't just begin overnight. The Intifada was slowly being built, going back to the 1970s, and because there were popular committees in the 1970s, and more of them in the 1980s. After 1982, you had the Palestinian, the PLO was now basically in exile. So the Palestinians, the young Palestinians especially, and the professionals in the occupied territories were taking were taking the lead on that and beginning to make their own decisions as to what they were doing. And after 1982, you start to get ideas of being circulated by a man whose name I've forgotten, but ideas about nonviolent action, nonviolent resistance. And those ideas were being batted around from 1982 on. So a lot was happening especially after 1982. And the Palestinians in the occupied territories knew that they couldn't rely that much anymore on the Arab states. You know, again, Arab states being ruled by the Arab. I'm talking now about the leaderships of these states, not the people, not the masses, because you had the support, just like in this country, you got the support of large numbers of people, but who's making the decisions? There's a ruling class that's making these decisions. And our politicians are answering to them. So if you want to put pressure on people, you've got to get the masses of people to put pressure on the politicians to put pressure and somehow convince the ruling class that it's in their interest to for example, end the occupation. I mean, that's what I'll eventually lead to. So anyway, I didn't want to go all around, but I was answered. I think for me that answers that question. You need to have a sense of who you are, okay? Because then having a sense of who you are helps to bond you and helps to bring solidarity, unity, and it gives you a reason to struggle, I think. So going further on with about a month after I had been there, I had been in touch with some Mennonites where I was learning Arabic that summer of 1990. It was at a Mennonite center in Jerusalem. And I got to be friends with a Mennonite, I guess a minister, and he worked up in Zababda, which was up in the northern part of the West Bank. And so I went up there one day on a taxi. Like I said, I didn't have any vehicles. So I took the taxi, and these are colectivos. I mean, they're collective taxis. There's a taxi station, and you jump into the front taxi, and the taxi driver waits until he gets 4 or 5 people, and then he takes off. And so I was in a taxi going to Nablus one day, and there was about 4 other women in the taxi with me, and one of them was in the late stage of pregnancy. Okay, this is another really sad story. We got about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way to Nablus, and the military pulled us over. Who knows why? And you don't ask why. You can ask why, but they're not going to answer you. So they pulled us over, and they searched me, and they I don't know what they did with the women, but the next thing I know, they're telling us to go down into this ravine, because we were on the side of a road. I mean, we were on the side of the road, and just below us was a ravine. So we had to walk down into the ravine. And you're not going to argue with these people because they got their guns in your face. Okay. So I tried to reason with the soldiers. I said, this woman is about to have a baby. Can we leave her up here? And they showed no empathy. So we all went down, and she went down gently. And then a few minutes later, after we were down below, I don't know what they were doing, they told us to come on back up. Well, when we got to the top, the woman was bleeding badly. And we tried to get the soldiers to rush her to a hospital in Nablus, which was not much of a hospital, and it was like a big clinic. And so they wouldn't do a damn thing. And so we put her in the taxi, and the taxi just flew to the hospital. And I never knew what happened. Okay, that was another day. Experience. And well, I can just give you some other experiences that happened inside the town of Ramallah. And for example, one day, my daughter came to visit me, and she was there, I think, for a week or 2 weeks. And we were in my translator's car, and we were driving to the girls' school. And we saw further down the road on this main road going down towards where I live, that there were all these young women, preteens and teenagers marching up the street, because there were the Intifada included many open demonstrations where people were carrying flags against the law. It's against the law, and they were singing Palestinian songs, national songs. Okay. By the way, which having a Palestinian flag, singing songs, anything that has to do with Palestinian culture was against the law, and you could be beaten, shot, arrested, imprisoned. And so I saw the military coming. So I told Dima, the woman who was driving, I said, Dima, take Sashin, my daughter, and go to the girls' school. I'm going to take pictures of this. And so I jumped out and waited by the side of the road. I didn't have the advantage of Rory's camera with a good telephoto lens where I could take pictures from far away. So I got as close as I could get comfortably, and there was a barber shop there, and so I started taking pictures, and the military just charged these girls. Now these are preteens and teens, and they charged them with batons, and they just started beating them on their heads with the batons, and like I said, the upper parts of their body. And the girls are screaming, they're running, they run into different buildings, I mean, stores on both sides of the street. And what does the military do? Okay, they use what's called what I called CS gas. I don't buy this whatever tear gas is. I never experienced it in 3.5 years. Everybody called it tear gas, but my eyes never teared up. You know what happened? I couldn't breathe in and breathe out. You have to hold your breath and run to get away from where that gas is coming, because you can't breathe. And if you're inside a building and they shot it inside buildings, if you read about CS gas, it's lethal inside. And so these girls were being beaten. They were shot with CS gas, for the ones that ran into different stores, and whoever was in the store was now subjected to the CS gas. And by the way, I'm going to show you a picture that CS gas is made in 2 places. One of them, now at least I'm not sure if it was made there, but the company is in Sherman Oaks. Rick, Sherman Oaks. I'm not quite sure where in Sherman Oaks. The other one was in Pittsburgh. The one I have a photograph of, the canister, and I got the photograph is from, this was from 1989, and it's in the principal's office at an elementary school, where he collected every time that the military, and they frequently invaded his school, and they shot the CS gas, and they shot the percussion grenades and bullets, and you see them all. He's got a collection of everything, and I just took a close-up picture of it. Anyway, that's another example of what happened on a regular basis. A lot of times, okay, let me go back to what the soldiers, what it was like in Ramallah. Every day you had soldiers everywhere. You had soldiers everywhere, and lots of soldiers. You had soldiers on rooftops, okay, monitoring what's going, not only monitoring what's going on below, but harassing the people down below. And then you had soldiers who were on foot, walking, usually in groups of 5 or 6, with their rifles ready to, to put in your face. And they patrolled not only, commercial areas, but residential areas. The soldiers on the rooftops were on the rooftops in commercial areas and in residential areas. And the third was you had soldiers driving around in either Jeeps or lorries. I mean, that presence was there night and day. The only ones that weren't there at night were the soldiers on the rooftops. After they got through urinating all over the rooftops and defecating, and I went up to some of those rooftops, and they just shit everywhere, and because they're there every day, and you could see where because I was told, and I checked, they shoot holes into the water tanks. And I was told, I never saw it, but I was told that they pee into the water tanks. So the people down below, whether it's a commercial building or a residential home, if they are peeing in there, then you're drinking water with human urine in it. And so, you got those soldiers everywhere. Now, these soldiers are there all day, and they aren't just waiting for you to do something wrong. They are intimidating and harassing all day long. And I did have
It looks like he froze up.
Did we lose Jeff?
Yeah,
Mr. Cooper?
Yeah, Jeff, I think you've screwed up. Norberta, can you get, is Jeff okay? Luckily, Jeff's wife is on the line, so
Yeah.
he should be able to just switch computers.
here she comes. Unmute, Norberta.
Norberta, please unmute yourself and tell us what's going on.
Okay. Yeah. Jeffrey's coming back. It was a short, I don't know, something in the communication, but he's okay. We'll continue.
Okay, I see him. He came on at the very last,
yeah, one of, you know,
Dale, dale. Go, Jeffrey, go.
okay, Jeff, I mean, you have froze, but please pick up where you left off. Is that possible?
yeah, what I wanted to say was, you know, like, I just want you to know that I could give so many examples of what the soldiers did when the leadership said close down at 1 o'clock. This was a across the class coalition of working class Palestinians, of merchants, and all the merchants closed down. Okay. Well, one of the things that happened at 1 o'clock early on, a lot of this, you know, was at its worst in 1990 before the Gulf War. Things changed a little after the Gulf War, but every day you had the, you know, the marketplace. It's like our marketplaces out here, you know, the farmers markets. Okay, so two things that the soldiers did: they went around and they tried anyway to force merchants to stay open, and they wouldn't stay open. And they put a lock on the door, and then the soldiers would bust the lock. And one of the things I saw them do one day, because I would buy food every other day to take home, fresh fruits and vegetables. The soldiers went around a couple times, and they would just knock all the fruits and vegetables off the tables and stomp on them. You know, just hard, you know, like that. Just horrible kind of stuff. Okay. Also, on several occasions, they would bust up peaceful demonstrations. The military, they would bust up demonstrations where people were not resisting, and they would just beat them up. And mostly elementary school, and right behind our school, the Friends Boys School, was a girls' elementary school. So we're talking about girls ages 6 to 10 or 11. And they were peacefully marching in front of their school one morning. And I got there, and all of a sudden military vehicles converged on, it was a T intersection, and they converged from 3 directions, and they just started beating up the girls. A lot of girls ran into classrooms, and I saw this a couple of times happen. They start shooting at CS gas into the classrooms. They start shooting those stun grenades, you know, just about blow your eardrums out. And so 30 girls, around 30 girls had to be evacuated, you know, by cars and an ambulance to hospitals. And you know what, there's 1,000 other things I could say. One of the things I want to say is to get away from all that is that the Intifada was a mass movement, essentially non-violent, okay, and you had a visible and an invisible aspect to it. The demonstrations that took place on a regular basis all over the occupied territories, that was visible, okay. But what Palestinians did was also civil disobedience, okay. They boycotted Israeli products. 90% of what was imported into the West Bank came from Israel. So Israel is putting Palestinian farmers out of business, okay? And you know what they did to the fishermen in Gaza. You know, when you can't even, you know, why won't you let Gazans go out into international waters and fish? And you won't even let them get to the international waters. So 90% of what was imported came from there. Now, Israeli farmers are being subsidized. They don't have to pay any kind of export duties or import taxes, okay? Whereas for Palestinians, you know, they had to pay export duties if they wanted to export something. There was also so there was a boycott, okay? There was a boycott. There was a civil disobedience of refusing to pay your taxes because the Israelis collected the taxes from Palestinians. And since before I run out of time, let me just say this. When they closed down all of the schools, they laid off around 8,000 in the government school. Well, that's all the schools in the occupied territories, in the West Bank anyway. They had about 8,000 government school teachers, okay? And I did some figuring in preparation for this. 8,000 teachers, average pay about $400 a month. And let's just say conservatively 9 months out of the year, okay? Do you know how much money the Israeli military administration, it was called a civil administration, but the Israeli military authorities were able to save in 1 year over $28 million, okay? And I think that was one of the reasons behind closing all of the schools for such a long period of time. That's money that was, I mean, the salaries of the teachers came from the taxes that the Israelis collected from the Palestinians. So I think they used it to bring in, to handle the Intifada. They used that 28 million in a year, and that, you multiply it 2 or 3 times. They used that money to bring in more soldiers, to set up more checkpoints, because Ramallah was just crawling with soldiers. Okay, and so anyway, that was the visible part. Okay, those demonstrations, and workers who were working, they were being exploited by Israelis inside Israel and by Zionist settlers in the West Bank, because they were forced to work there in Israel or in the West Bank because they had no employment. Okay, and why did a lot of them not have employment? Because land confiscations. If you take away your land, how are you going to survive? So you're forced to become a cheap source of labor. You know, no benefits, no right to unionize, no rights at all as a worker. Okay, so that's another aspect of it. And then there's the invisible, and the invisible was the kind of work I was doing, that was planning night and day in the shadows to develop a curriculum. We were trying to develop a teacher center in Ramallah. I put on over 3 years, 3 different national conferences. I don't know how we were able to do it. I thought the Israeli military would bust them up, but they never did. Okay, so I think I could go on and on and I could go on. Let me just say that you wanted lessons learned. Then I'm going to read. Okay, my greatest takeaway from my time was the reaffirmation that the Palestinians and outsiders must avoid despair and hopelessness. We've got to have faith in the future and keep trying to make the world into one which people see others as a mirror reflection of themselves and always care for and nurture one another. Outsiders like me had a choice. We could pack up and leave, okay? But the Palestinians had no choice. They wouldn't emigrate. This is their historical homeland and their cultural legacy. So, you know, they stayed and continued to struggle, and their struggle is intimately bound up with their own sense, their own powerful sense of self-worth and dignity. And what the Intifada gave Palestinians was a sense of self-worth and a sense of dignity. And like I said, there's just a lot. There's a lot. One of the things I wrote is our human dignity, our humanity requires that we always fight against injustice, no matter what the odds are for success. And I kept asking myself, where's the UN? Where's the UN? You know, where's any outside support? There was no outside support. And the only support we got was from people like everybody who's on this Zoom today, you know. And anyway, I think we should probably open it up for questions and answers. And
Okay, thanks, Jeff. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions, and to help organize this, please electronically raise your hand. The way to raise your hand is to go on to the bottom of your Zoom page where it says reactions. It's a smiley face. Move your cursor up, and there you can raise your hand. I've just done it for myself, just to show how it can be done. And since I don't see any hands raised, I'll ask the first question. You said that there were general strikes called, and when the general strike was called, everyone really closed down. So that means this first Intifada was very well organized, very broadly organized. How was that able to be done?
okay, I don't know. All I know is that okay, the Intifada started on December 9th, more or less, 1987. On January 8th, you had the issuance that the leadership, what became the Intifada leadership, issued its first of dozens of communiques. These were calls to action, appeals. You know, they weren't orders. These were, and so these people were shrewd. Now, if you read, it'll say, you know, it was run by young people. I'm sure it was made up of younger people and older people. New blood, not the old, you know, the old guards, the old wealthy families. This is new blood from at least from 1982 on. And the leadership, according to everything that I heard, was basically people who are inside the occupied territories and not in exile, not the PLO in exile. Although the communiques very quickly began to say that, you know, the PLO is you know, we support the PLO, and so what they did as an outsider, well, two things. One, as an outsider, first of all, and as a Jew, there's no way I was going to start asking questions, because I wanted to ask the man Khalil, who I admired so much and worked so closely with. I wanted to say, Khalil, are you part of this leadership? But I was afraid to ask anybody. You know, I did not want to, you know, to know that I didn't want to be seen as somebody who's asking questions, because then nobody knows why I'm asking these questions. So all I know is you had all of these committees, women's committees, okay, agricultural committees, healthcare committees. You had al-Haq, you had law in the service of humanity, human rights law being developed. And all of these things were being done in a sense, on the quiet side. Okay. And somebody was coordinating them. That was really clear. Okay. And every day at 1 o'clock, except Fridays and Sundays, every day at 1 o'clock, everything shut. It started at 12, and then they went to 1 o'clock. Everything shut down. So everybody supported this, and everybody supported not paying taxes. And what shows this the unity and the solidarity among classes, working class people who now don't have a source of income, because they quit those jobs. They also, I had some friends who by 92 at the beginning, he was working back for the post office again, but he had quit the post office. Some of them were working with the police. They quit the police, and some of them were on these councils, and they quit those. They were told to resign, and people did that. But one of the things, in my opinion, that shows the unity and the solidarity was the Israelis made them pay. They made them pay by striking as much fear and as much brutality and violence as they could on the Palestinians. And if you can hold your own as a large, hundreds of thousands of people can hold your own against this massive violence. There was already violence. The occupation was already violent. But what they did is they added more violence to it to break the Intifada. That's why they went to the PLO to negotiate. They went to the PLO because they saw that they could not militarily solve this. They couldn't strike enough fear into the people. And a lot of those kids that were throwing stones, it was their way. It was their way after a lot of them had lost all self-respect. And the one way to gain self-respect as a 7 or 8 or 9-year-old was to pick up a stone. And remember, who were they throwing the stones at? They were throwing them at soldiers. Where were they throwing the stones? Inside their own Palestinian communities. You know, they didn't go off into Israel and throw stones. So they did not let all that military violence intimidate them. And that shows to me the strength and the solidarity of the movement. And they weren't able to break them. Tony, you had your hand up.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, Tony,
Yeah.
I see three.
Jeff,
there were
Jeff,
four hands raised. There was
Jeff Geiger had his hand up first, but it seems like he's taking it down.
Okay, go.
Well,
Tony.
I'll talk if it's all right. Yeah, well, first of all, I just really wanted to thank you, Jeff. And I just found that not only was your presentation informative for me, but it was very emotionally moving. And I really respect that you did this, you know, that you had the courage and the humanity to go and do this for 3 years. I think this is a remarkable thing. And I have a question, and if it's not something you want to go into, or it's involves too much, feel free to just bypass it. But my question is, that was roughly 30 years ago. And how do you see things for the Palestinians today and for the Israeli-Palestinian relationship today?
I'm not too optimistic. Not too optimistic. I've been really sick for the last couple of years, and especially the last 6 or 7 months. So I haven't gotten into the depths of it, so, I mean, to what's going on, other than what I read in Haaretz English, and especially by Amira Haas and Gidon Levy and a few others, and what I read in Ramsey Baroud, who's one of my heroes. I really think that the only way things will change is when when the powerful governments, and I'm talking about the ruling classes, I want to really make that distinction. When the powerful ruling classes in the Western world decide that enough is enough, then maybe we'll see some change. But violence is not going to get the Palestinians anywhere, and nonviolence we were creating some really wonderful things. I mean, that the Intifada took on a life of its own. You know, people, it had a dynamic of its own. People were alive, and there was a lot of warmth. And I'm assuming you have to be on the ground, you know, there, and I'm not on the ground. So I mean, I know about people being assassinated. And by the way, Palestinians are being killed every day today. It's the funeral this week. And why did the soldiers have to be there? You know, I mean, you can ask all kinds of questions. They have to be there because that's the way it works. They've been taught since childhood that Palestinians are subhuman, that they're terrorists, that they and by the way, the Intifada communiques, the leadership's communiques, never mentioned the word Jews or Jewish. They always use Zionist and Zionists in all those communiques. You'd look in vain, okay? So they were highly, politically conscious, so I forget where I'm going. So that's part of my problem. My brain's not working. Anyway, I'm not too hopeful. But the Palestinians have dignity, and I mean, there's no question in my mind. It's a constant struggle. I mean, it's different now than it was then, because I've been reading that there's some concern about suicides. You never heard the word suicide, as bad as things were. And especially for children, because they were the special targets. And so, Jeff, you can ask why they control the schools. Why did they target the children so much? I really think they wanted parents to emigrate. They wanted parents to get the hell out as part of Zionist ideology. Zionism is a toxin, and so. I really think that what you're going to need is outside pressure from the ruling classes. They're going to have to see it's in their interest to have Israel back off and let the Palestinians have a state, or I mean, it's up to the Palestinians what kind of a state they want. Okay. I mean, I would like to see, one state, but I mean, if they want two states, because during the first Intifada, basically what they were calling for was an end to the occupation. And they made it very clear that was where I was going with this. They made it very clear they do not hate Jews. They do not hate Judaism. They do not want to kill Jews. They are not fighting people. They are fighting structures of oppression and injustice directed against them. They were clear, and they were also clear that the way to achieve this was through diplomacy. They weren't trying to overthrow the Israeli military. It would have been futile then, okay? They weren't trying to, and they weren't trying to overthrow the state of Israel. They wanted diplomacy, and they wanted what would come out of the diplomacy is the right of Palestinians to self-determination, up to and including the establishment of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, and the right of return to Palestinians who had been forced out in 1948, 49, 47, actually, 48, 49, and in 1967. That's what they wanted. And that's what they still want. Palestinians are not anti-Jewish. The closest thing, somebody visited me once, and he said, God, they're talking about the Jewish. And I said, no, they're saying Jaish, right, Rory? That Jaish means the military, the soldiers. And he thought they were saying the Jews are coming. No, it's the Jaish, the military, that's coming. Anyway, that's the answer. That's my best I can do on that one.
Okay, Tony, unmute yourself.
Yeah, Jeff, I seem to recall that there was a whole bunch of underground education that was going on at the time as well.
Oh, yes, that was part of
People
the, if that was part of my prepared talk, I would have done it systematically and gone through. I really apologize for that. I was so nervous. Yeah, that was part of the civil disobedience.
Right.
Because the order was, that the school, it's a military order. Schools are to remain closed. Okay, so then you get these committees, because what was happening is first graders and second graders were losing up to 2 years of school. And so what was happening is the other thing that there's so many things to mention. The Israelis made it clear that even, and they would close for, let's say, 8 of the 9 months or 8.5 of the 9 months. Let's just say they closed for 8 months and they were open for 4 months. Okay, that was all you got in 1989-90 school year. And the Israeli military orders were that you have to graduate all students to the next grade level. Okay, so you're studying Arabic, whatever level you're at. You're studying math, or and so you got numeracy skills and literacy skills, and you've only completed, let's say, 1 month in a school year, and now you're supposed to go to the next level. Well, think of the stress on teachers. I'm teaching second year Arabic. My students come to me, they've only completed 1 month of first year Arabic.
Mhm.
And my curriculum that's required from the Israeli military authorities, which, civil administration, Department of Education, well, they're saying I got to teach them the next level. Well, if a student is learning to add, doesn't know how to add and subtract, how are you going to teach them how to multiply when they get into your class? So the challenge is for the teachers. And like I said, there's many other things. The fact that parents in private schools are pulling their kids out, especially the Palestinian Americans, bringing them home. So we had financial problems to keep the school afloat, because, like if there's no school, why are parents paying the school? And we relied a lot on Quaker donations to keep the school going, to keep paying people. And anyway, it's the same thing with if you were ready to graduate. And by the way, I didn't even mention universities. All 6 Palestinian universities were closed from before the Intifada, going back to October '87, and they only started really opening them for the first time in September 1990 to gradually. They opened Bethlehem first, and they opened a few others. And
Yeah, well, that's mostly what I knew about, because I once attended a lecture by one of the professors back east who was teaching there at the time, and he said they closed the universities down, and we had a whole underground university.
Yeah,
People would meet in homes. People would meet in homes. The students would go to the homes, and that's where they would pick up the lessons.
Yeah, well, they met in small groups, in homes, in gardens, in mosques, in churches. Okay, and they were in this case they were experimenting with forms of pedagogy that were more democratic and more open to hearing from students, that were more student-centered, which is what some of the work I was doing in introducing, the progressive ideas to other teachers, which were really difficult to get across when you've been trained in the old way of lecture and the student is passive and it's teacher-centered. So anyway, as soon as the Israelis found out that these underground classes were taking place, even though you only had 10 kids, maybe, they outlawed them, and you could be imprisoned and fined. And then Khalil at our school started printing up these dittos of homework assignments, and we got them to people's homes. And so in this case, we're talking about ditto masters, with lessons that the parents can give to their kids. And when the Israelis found out about that, they criminalized that.
Yeah. Well, it's all of a piece, and you can almost understand the inequities in the Oslo Accord when suddenly the PA was in charge of at least a number of different places in Area A. Which supposedly meant that the soldiers couldn't enter there. So, I mean, after all the violence that you described, you can almost see how Oslo had at least a kind of a relief to that that military thing, although of course in practice, they would come in.
Yeah, the PA, by the way, to answer one of the questions I was supposed to talk about, the PA basically blew off all the work that we did. We started a teacher center. We were developing textbooks for grades 1 through 6. A lot of great work. I mean, when I talk about progressive pedagogy, it's having classes that are democratically run, that are student-centered, where students are talking to one another. There's a focus on writing. There's a focus on group activities. There's a focus on writing across the curriculum. All kinds of great ideas went right down the drain. They just let it all go. They bought into the Israeli form of rote memorization type of education and teacher-centered.
Yeah. But we got some other questions, so
Uri, unmute yourself.
Thanks for that. Thanks for sharing. You filled in the little details that I didn't know. I knew the whole picture. Somebody who.
Uri, get closer to your microphone, please.
Let me put some volume here. Can you hear me now?
it's a little better. Turn it up all the way.
Let me see if I can do something about the adjusting. of
Get
the
closer
volume.
to the mic.
Okay. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
So first of all, thank you for what you did there. You helped me feel the little details that I was not on the level that you were talking, but I knew all along what's been going there. And I just wanted to add a few things to what you said that which is correct and true. I happen to see that in the past 55 years, the state of Israel did a big mistake. They basically came from denial of the existence of the Palestinians. And the more they oppressed them, the more they actually coalesced and created the Palestinians. And even if they didn't exist exactly in 67, Israel contributed to that. Basically, by oppressing everybody, you force them to be together. So one of the unintended consequences of the Israeli government came out that actually the Palestinians are all more unified than they were ever were in 67. Now, a couple of things about what you mentioned. What you talked about, what the Israeli soldiers did, it didn't exist in vacuum. Everything goes back to Israel. The level of violence that has imported into Israel in the past 30 or 40 years is something that came because of a lot of these soldiers were actually instructed to not treat them as human beings. Essentially, Israel was trying to deny their humanity, and you pointed at it. But it works in funny ways, because if you deny somebody else's humanity, before too long, you get yourself involved in the fact that it has a tendency to kind of like cross borders. Israel itself suffers mightily because of that. So whatever they try to impose on the Palestinian didn't escape the Israeli society. Now you mentioned another element which is true, but the Zionism idea that should have been actually retired in 1948 is still the one permeating the state of Israel. And 90% of the Jews in Israel, if you ask them, they say they are Zionists. They don't even understand what it means, but for them, Zionism is like a tenet of law. You have to say I'm a Zionist. And they don't realize, most of them, the damage it does for the state of Israel. Now, I'm just touching about points. Up till 48, at least, in the world, the Jews were considered the smart one, the David, who were fighting the Goliaths. In the past 55 years, Israel became the Goliath. The smartness disappeared. It became stupid. And when you deal with an occupation of somebody who's opposing you that you're not willing to acknowledge, and the state of Israel never wanted to acknowledge the Palestinian as a nation. They still deny it. Once you do that, you basically turn out to be stupid because you do not recognize the main issue. And the main issue that you're dealing with the nation. And the state of Israel, up to this day, the politicians, they deny the fact that the Palestinians are a nation. There's a lot of derivatives out of it. And Israel itself, as a state, paying, I'm not saying anything that the Palestinians are not suffering, but Israel, by own stupidity, inflicted a lot of damage on Israel and its own citizens. And it's not ending, it's actually getting worse. So now you talked about, I just read this week, one of the guys who writes in Haaretz, he says, the only way for Israel to get out from this conundrum is a black swan event. That's the level of understanding of the people who actually, for the past 20 or 30, 40 years, wanted to recognize the Palestinians and wanted to actually create some kind of a livable situation. Right now, some of the living Israelis believe that only a black swan event, like something that happened in Russia, invading Ukraine, the United States stopping supporting Israel, something which is not predictable, you know, the black swan theory. In other words, the level of frustration and the level of despair in the 5 or 10% of the people who lead Israel, they realize that we are stuck in such a conundrum that we, the Israelis, cannot untangle ourselves. And this is really the thing that's happening right now in the Israeli society. The Israeli society is...
Uri, do you have a question?
No, I never have questions. I always have diatribes, but I just wanted to acknowledge him because he pointed at a few things. So no, I wanted to acknowledge you for your courage living through the Intifada. And by the way, the Israeli army in 1991-92 is considered moderate compared to what they do right now. So whatever your experiences were, the Israeli army is 10 times worse right now. Because I listened to the Breaking the Silence and Combatant for Peace and Yeshdin and all the Israeli organizations, B'Tselem, that represent the 1% or 2% of the same Israelis who actually realize that we are there. We need to live together, otherwise we die together. And unfortunately, and this is
Jeff, I just want to, I need to say something. You know, one of the things I was going to talk about that I didn't have time was the fact that so many of these soldiers are 17 that were in the Ramallah are 17 to 19 years old. Okay. And one of the things that was clear to me, you know, I mean, I knew how they were brought up. I mean, it's a no-brainer for me. But one of the things that was clear, they're always going around. They don't talk to you like a human being. And I'm talking about even me. As an outsider, they talk to you with their rifle right in your face. Well, once I got through being so scared, I mean, every time that happened, I looked in the eyes of those soldiers, and you know what I saw? What did I see, everybody? Fear. They were scared shitless, and I'm thinking, this man's got a gun in my face. All he's got to do is pull a trigger, and there's no conversation. And he's scared. He's frightened. And I need to say this. I just need to say this because we got a large number of Jewish people here, and I hope you'll appreciate this side. Okay, I was stopped. I used to stay late, even though everything closed down at 1 o'clock. Okay, I would stay late and work because I don't have any computer at home and I'm living alone. And so I would stay until around 5, 6 o'clock every night. And then I'd have to take my chances going home that the military is not going to jack me up and throw me up against the wall. Well, that happened a bunch of times, you know, and they would ask me, where are you going? And I'd say, Ani holech labait. And they'd look and they start to talk to me in Hebrew. And I, you know, like that's about as much as I remember from Hebrew school. Anyway, I said, I'm going home. And so then they were rude. They were physical. And here's the story that touches me to this day. One Friday night, I was leaving the school, and after being stopped about 10 or 12 times and being roughed up most times, and then told to go on, these soldiers drove up in a lorry and there were two soldiers up, I guess they were standing behind the, what do you call it? The place where the driver is anyway, and behind on a bench, I guess, because they were up above the cabin. They were above the cabin with their guns, but they said in a really sweet way. I mean, it's a nice way. I took it that way, and I'm very sensitive to how people relate to me. And they said, where are you going? And I said, "Ani holech labayit." And the soldier, in a very warm way, said, and kind of he smiled and went like that. Instinctually, I didn't think about this. It just came out. I said, "Shabbat Shalom." He turned to me with a look and a warmer smile and said, "Shabbat Shalom." And they both waved, and I went home. And that meant a lot to me. That showed me the humanity, that there is humanity there. And I'm a human person before I'm a Jew. Okay. And my humanity it's layered with my Jewish upbringing, but my humanity comes first. And there was humanity coming out of those two soldiers that afternoon. And it's a story that I'll never forget. I mean, it's a picture in my mind that I'll never forget. Anyway, I hope that means something to a lot of you. Because I mean, you just don't want to stereotype all soldiers, because I feel for soldiers that go out there and die and kill other people. They're being told, go there. And I'm not talking about just there. I'm talking about wherever wars are being fought.
You touched on a very
Dick.
important point. The point was basically that
What about Rick?
the Israelis realized, and actually the whole conflict coalesced Israel. Without the conflict, Israel falls apart because there are so many fighting sections. The common denominator, the enemy, the Palestinians, the non-humans. So in a funny way, Israel needs the conflict as much as to survive against itself. Anyhow, I took too much time. Jeff, thank you.
This is my question, Jeff. You mentioned the funeral of Shireen Abu Akleh in Jerusalem, how the pallbearers were attacked. But I think when you were, the first Intifada was before Al Jazeera, but do you remember anything about reporters or press coverage or harassment of reporters at that time?
No, the only thing I remember is that somebody from the New York Times came, and I told him I had things to tell him. He didn't want to hear it. And I just.
So how did the word get out then to the rest of the world? What was happening?
What was happening? I guess there were reporters. I will say this, because I haven't said it. I never signed my name to anything. Okay. I never put my name on anything. And there's a book written by, it's a book called A Quiet Revolution, the First Palestinian Intifada and Nonviolent Resistance by Mary Elizabeth King. If you look at her footnote, she talks, the only book I found that quotes, I put out a newsletter, a quarterly newsletter in English, sent it all over the world. She quotes it, but she also says this was written by Khalil Lakshi. That's fine. I didn't want anybody to know who the hell I was. I don't want to be anybody's target. So nobody knew who, what I was doing except the people I met with. And so when it came to reporters, the reporters would come to Khalil. I stayed away. The only time I went is when there were a group of actors and actresses that came from the UK, and Julie Christie was among them, and she wouldn't let me take her picture. I mean, I was taking pictures of the people there for that we would use, and she kept going like this, and that was the only time. But every time people came, they talked to Khalil. He was the front person, and I was paranoid. I was really paranoid. So nobody knew. My name is nowhere, except maybe in some file in Tel Aviv somewhere.
Martin, unmute yourself, Martin.
Jeff, one of the stories you told me, I like personally the human stories and the relationships you made with some young people in Palestine. when they asked you, do you believe in God? I thought that was very, if you don't mind talking about that.
Okay, the first night, the second night I was in the Ramallah, that was my first night in the new house. And the young men from the community came to see who is this guy, you know, to meet him. So they all came around. We were sitting at my next door neighbor's place. I don't know if you remember Rory, our next door neighbor. They had a little place you could sit out in front. And so the first question they asked me was, "Are you a Muslim?" And my immediate response was, "No, I don't believe in God." Well, instantaneously, I just knew instantaneously that was a mistake. That was a big mistake. So without even taking another breath, I said, wait a minute. I need to explain that. I don't believe in a personal God. I believe in, and then I ran down Spinoza. I talked about how there's a divine spirit in everything, animate and inanimate, you know, in stones and trees and in the flowers and people. And I became really good friends with them. I was such good friends with them because those were my friends. They would come over and I would teach some of them English, you know, speaking English better, because they spoke English, but they wanted to learn better and learn how to read and write. And so this was the only socializing I could do, because there was no place I could go to meet with anybody. I couldn't even meet with Khalil because he lived up at the school. And so just before the war broke out, the first Gulf War, and the tensions were running so high in the Ramallah, all US citizens that were there that I knew of, including my roommate at the time, they were all pulled out because they were volunteers with some church group. And I was told that the church groups had insurance and the insurance policies wouldn't cover them if anything happened. So they made them go back to the US. Well, I was there on my own. So I stayed. I was a little worried, but I stayed. And one night, two of those young men came over, and I can't remember their names, but they came over and they said, "Listen, Jeff, if anybody bothers you, let us know." And that meant a lot to me also. And then there's a lot of stories I could tell about taking Abu Khalid, my other neighbor's his 6-year-old son, and walking with him under strict curfew, because the curfew lasted 40 days, and he owned all these chickens, and the chickens needed to be fed and given water. And he snuck over to my house and said, "Can you please go?" Because he knew he could get shot or taken to prison. I said, "I'll go if you let me take Hamoudi, who was 6," because I was 48 years old and Hamoudi was 6, and I figured I would walk holding his hand. I'm clearly not a Palestinian. I got this little boy. I'm an older man, and the first time we got by the gas station, and the military saw me and they started shooting, but they weren't shooting at us. I think they were shooting in the air, where I would have heard bullet holes or bullets crashing into the building. And so then I peeked out and they pointed and I pointed, "I'm going this way." They went, "No." And they pointed, "Go back where you came." So I waited an hour and went back an hour later and went and fed his chickens and gave them water, because you never know when they're going to lift the curfew. And by the way, when we got down below where his shop was, I looked up on the roof of his shop, had 2 soldiers sitting there. Thank God those soldiers didn't want to be bothered with me. And so I went in and took care of that. And I mean, that's just one of many, many, many stories.
Tony, you're next online, but there are 2 people beyond you who
No,
haven't asked yet.
there were people ahead of me. I put my hand back up because I have another question. I thought I'd be at the end of the queue, but Martin had his hand up, and I guess that's Charles's wife has got her hand up, and Yasmin as well.
Yeah, why not Charles's wife give her question now? Okay.
It would be Charles, and he's got a call from across the country, so he's on another call, so he can't do it.
Okay, well, let's Yasmin, unmute yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for such a great presentation. Thank you for sharing all these stories that you always shared, with us, and you lived, that with us.
Tell them who you are.
So I'm Yasmin. I'm from Gaza. Jeff worked with my mother in Gaza in the 90s. Right now I'm in Canada. I live in Canada. I graduated from Eastern Michigan University. And so Jeff is a family for us. We always remember him as one of us, and we keep communication with him. So now you got me emotional. don't do that. So,
I
anyway,
worked with Yasmin's mother very, very closely. And she was also a dear, dear friend, dear friend.
yes. So anyway, what I wanted to ask you, because I've been in academia for a long time in the US, and I know how the academic discourse looks like, but as a Palestinian coming to the US, my experience is different from yours. Now, what is the most challenging thing that you faced coming from Palestine and started to share, your own experience, and especially teaching in higher education? If you could reflect a little bit, because I know that you told me some stories about, your students and how you were trying to teach them history to humanize them. And how those students, especially with what media usually brings, the pictures, and how the Palestinian people are depicted in the American media, and how would your students react, to what you teach them and what you share with them in Palestine over the years?
You talking about the students here in the US when I talked
Yes.
about Palestine?
Yes.
Okay, when I taught about Palestine, my method of teaching is to have you read sources closely, and then I raise questions. I raise all kinds. But for example, I had my students, when we were dealing with modern history, read selections from Herzl's The Jewish State. Okay, and so the questions just were easy. They pop out. I mean, do you agree with him? For example, he says Jews have always been persecuted everywhere in the world, and they always will be. So I asked him, do you agree with that? Now, my students are sitting in a circle. So they're not answering me, they're answering one another. And I want them to challenge one another. I want them to learn how to listen. So they would discuss that. And then when you're dealing with the 1947 UN resolution 181, I would ask the students to analyze it. How did they justify giving 55% of the land to people who only had 31% of the population and only owned 6.7% of the land? So let them talk about it. Let them disagree with one another. Look, you know what? I taught journal writing here, but I also taught it in Palestine, and that by the way was the biggest thing. And I see Aya is here, her sister's here on this as well, and Shukran Aya, and anyway, what I did that was one of the most moving workshops I ever gave was with Arabic teachers in Gaza, and your mother was there as my translator. But I was teaching them journal writing, not only for language classes, but even for social studies classes, where you give the students an opportunity to express themselves in writing without editing themselves. So everybody has to bring a journal every day to class, and I give them suggested topics. The topic I gave them, this was in June of 1993. I'll never forget it, because it was right at the end of the school year, and I was I was planning on leaving in September of '93. And and the topic that I asked them to write about, I actually gave 3 topics. And I always told students, you can choose between the 3 topics. The one topic that most of them picked, so far as I know, was the 400 men who the Israelis deported from Gaza in December of 1992, and they sent them up to the hillside up there in the winter in Lebanon. Okay, and so then I call on people to read, and there was one other woman in the group, and so I called on her first, and she wrote hers in poetic form, and then she read it, and then this professor read it, and he was crying when he read it. He was crying, and I thought, what an amazing experience for everybody in the room, because this shows you the extent to which you can use and how far you can go with journal writing, because the rule is you have 8 minutes to write on one of the topics that you select. And if you have nothing to say, you have to keep your pen on paper and say, I have nothing to say, I have nothing to say. And everybody always writes. Well, when I was teaching because I taught a class in English, but it was world history in Ramallah. And I had journal writing there too. And one of the topics was Palestinian females. And I always ask 3 people to read after 8 minutes. And one of the boys read, and the girls went crazy. And so what it did is it brought out a discussion of the value and the role of Palestinian females in Palestinian society. I didn't have to teach anything. They were talking to one another, and they're learning to have confidence in their ability to express themselves. They're learning to listen respectfully to others, because people always say, well, what happens if they get disrespectful? No, they learn right away to be respectful, and they're talking to each other. They're not talking to me, and they're sitting in a circle. So there's no point of reference, because if you're at the front of the room, all the focus is on you. That's the kind of thing I was trying to get across to Palestinian teachers in Gaza and in the West Bank when I worked. It was one of many, many things that I tried to put forward. So that's how, I taught by having students think and talk to one another and listen to one another, criticize one another. And to me, if the topics are human, you're humanizing them, and you're using the subject matter to make them better human beings, whether they're Jewish, whether they're Muslim, whether they're Catholics, Protestants, or whatever. That's what our education should be about, to humanize us.
Yeah,
So,
but nowadays a lot of politics, can affect sometimes even the relationship. When I was teaching at Eastern Michigan, I was attacked many times by students, at the graduate level.
What do you mean you were attacked?
They were not only disagree with me, but they would come, and say to me, hey, don't talk about our politics and our president. So a lot of emotions can be in place, especially when they see someone coming from Palestine. In my situation, I'm a Palestinian Muslim wearing a scarf. So my identity can play a role in how students may react when I teach something about my country and my history.
And you're a woman.
And a woman too.
Okay, Charles.
I'm feeling kind of at a loss, not just with the Israel-Palestine situation, but also with, American politics and the United States foreign policy in Ukraine, blah, blah, blah. It's just, I listened to this debate between Joseph Avasar and Alan Dershowitz. Did you happen to catch that, Jeff?
No, I was too busy preparing for this.
Okay, well, you didn't miss much. And I imagine most of you on this call are familiar with the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation approach to the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Just to put it briefly, it says, create a third government, where it's egalitarian parliament, and you have to, in order to have it come into existence, you have to recognize all the existing power structures and you give them veto power. But basically the idea is that you can then pass things with approval from all the people who want to participate in the entire area of Israel and Palestine, and that would shame these existing power structures into doing the right thing, because the things you could pass would be, common sense, and the things that they do is the opposite. But anyway, so one encouraging thing was the MSNBC has widely reported both the death of the journalist and the attack on her funeral procession. I never thought I would see that kind of thing on American public media. But my feeling about, where we are at right now in the US is that it's not coming together. We're moving farther and farther apart. And I wonder if what you were able to do in Ramallah and survive, and having that experience and looking at our situation, I know there's got to be a way that we can work together across organizational silos to like when you were talking about the fact that the Intifada was really well organized, but it was invisible how it was done. I mean, that's the kind of thing that I see is going to be necessary for us to turn the current political situation around. If just one day everybody went on a global strike just to say, look, we all know we can get along and care about each other, and you guys are fucking up. And then, go back to work the next day and just let them sit with that shock. And then if that doesn't do anything, do it for 2 days, a month later, something like that. Anyway, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that kind of a thing.
I believe in the power of social classes, and it would be great. You're talking about getting everybody together. What about those people, those people that support the Trumpian ideas and support and the racists in the society? We got to deal with so they're learning this. They aren't born that way. So we've got to control. That's why education is so important. We've got to control that narrative. And they're controlling it because they have the power. So it's, I don't have the answers. One of the things that I wrote out, and I won't read it, but one of the questions I wrote at the end was, when in terms of, what I learned, where the hell I put it, but it's there's no longer an Athenian empire. There's no longer a Roman empire. And for those of us Jews, there's no longer a so-called empire of King David, because there never was one as far as I'm concerned anyway. But there's no British empire. There's no French empire. The Spanish empire is gone. The Ming empire is gone. The Moguls, all those empires are gone. The ones in the continent of Africa, the Maya, the Aztec, the Inca, they're all gone. Okay, so we don't know what the future holds. That's why I'm saying all we've got to do is have faith, have hope, And one thing I've learned from my illness, because it's kept me in the bed for so long, is when I'm inactive, I lose hope. I mean, I really lose it. And so when you're active, involved in trying to change the world, you have hope. But if you're inactive, it's easy to become cynical, pessimistic. And so that we just have to keep fighting. As long as we're alive, keep fighting for a better world for those that come after us. I mean, that's my only answer, because there's no guarantees. I organized the workers at a lead smelter back in the 1970s, and we were able to temporarily, and we clean that plant up. I mean, those of you from LA know about Exide. Well, before it was Exide, it was National Lead, and I organized all 260 workers there, and we got National Lead temporarily anyway, until they got rid of me, to clean up that plant. And now what have you got? You got 2,500 homes on the east side of LA where they have to dig up all the lead that's in the soil, okay? And back in the 1960s, or in the early 1970s, I went after the Air Quality Management District and said, these people are poisoning not only the workers in the plant, but the community. And it looked like we were going to get crushed, but we ended up winning. So, and you just have to keep your faith, and you keep your faith by continuing to struggle. That's all. I think everybody here knows what I'm talking about. I mean, it doesn't give you any guarantees, but nobody guaranteed anybody anything.
Judy,
Right, Tony?
Hey,
Judy, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, this is just a general question. When you're talking about the army, it just occurs to me, does the Israeli army, do they ever do anything except, do you ever go anyplace outside of Israel? Is it just Gaza and just parading around and just torturing Palestinians? Or, I mean, because we're in all kinds of countries, but is the Israeli army anyplace else? Or is that all they got to do is just defend against the Palestinians? I mean,
Well, sometimes they go into Lebanon. I mean, they've been in Lebanon in the
Well,
past.
I know Lebanon. Okay, when they attacked Lebanon, but aside from that, I mean, they have this giant army of just these people have nothing to do except monitor.
How else are they going to justify getting $3.8 billion a year? Come on. You know what? I once told Norman Finkelstein that I think that they are not taking Hamas out, that they can take Hamas out. And they don't want to take, I'm talking about Israel, can take out Hamas. And I'm talking now about 20, 30 years ago. They can take Hamas out, but if they take Hamas out, you have to have an enemy. So if they take them out, how are they going to justify getting that money?
So, but that's all they do is they're just in Israel. And people in the army can go home at night. I mean,
yeah, except when they're, you know what, I felt at certain times, and I thought about it when I was preparing this, is that I think when the military's on the streets in the Ramallah, they must think that I've got to beat people up, because why else am I here if it's not to beat up people? You know, it's like I have to have a sense of purpose, and this gives me purpose. Yeah, I mean, you think about it. Armies are trained to go after an aggressive force that's coming after them aggressively, and the Palestinians in the Intifada were civilians, unarmed civilians that were talking about nonviolent confrontations. So that's going to blow the mind of a military. What I mean, and then to talk about, well, you got to have the military running because you have to rule by military force. But I always thought, how do you explain to people in the future that you had a military occupation that was called the civil administration, and the Department of Education in the occupied territories spent its time closing down Palestinian schools and universities?
Everybody, when they're 18, they go in the army for what, 2 years or?
I don't know.
2 years for women, 3 years for men.
When you're 18?
Yes, right after high school.
Do they have
And then they get a year off and they can travel anywhere they want. and it's subsidized. And when they come back, they go to college. But they're all militarized. There's very few that refuse service.
Does Israel have a navy?
Oh, yeah, sure.
I know they have an air force. I mean, you just never hear about their navy. Okay.
Oh, off the Gaza shore.
And then off of it in a lot. And I think Israeli troops are in Azerbaijan as well. They have a lot of weapons that they've sold, and they help train the people in Azerbaijan to operate them.
Yeah, they did that in Central America in the 1980s.
Yeah, that too.
They practically don't even need an army. I mean, nobody's attacking them, and never mind. Okay, I'm done. Thanks.
Okay, Tony.
Can I get a follow-up question, comment on that? Jeff, you were talking about the tear gas, and it was manufactured in Sherman Oaks and manufactured in Pittsburgh. And of course, all that subsidy that we give for the billions is usually turns out to be a credit to defense industry suppliers, like the guys who make the tear gas and all the rest of it. I wanted to tell everybody, a very brave Canadian-Israeli journalist named David Sheen, S-H-E-E-N, has been here in Southern California for the past 3 or 4 days. And he gave a long lecture on how the philosophy of Meir Kahane, who was actually outlawed from the Israeli Knesset years ago, has actually become almost legitimized in certain areas of Israeli politics, and worst of all, in United States politics. And I put in the chat room his website, and in the lower left corner on his homepage, you can see the lectures that he gave, not only about that infiltration of Kahanism into Israeli and American politics, but also the latest information that he has gathered about the assassination of Alex Ode, which was carried on by Kahanist people down in Orange County. So what it told me when I attended the lecture is we have to educate ourselves a little bit more in order to organize for this resistance. And this is one way to organize and understand. We got real problems here, long way to go.
Was Kahana the one behind the who trained the guy who assassinated Rabin?
No,
but the Kahanist philosophy was behind Baruch Goldstein, who went into the mosque,
Oh,
the Abraham Mosque,
that's what I'm thinking.
and slaughtered 29 Palestinian worshipers and wounded scores and scores of others, and has always been seen as a big hero.
When was that?
Trying to think,
84?
82, 84, something like that.
1994, February.
1994.
Okay, Benji, why don't you unmute yourself and ask the next question?
Well, I wanted to respond to Judy's question about why does Israel need an army? Well, one, of course, it needs an army because it's a militaristic state. You can't very well be a militaristic state with expansionist goals without an army. But there's another question there, because the United States needs Israel to have an army. Israel, and to a very large extent, is an appendage of the military-industrial complex of the United States. The billions of dollars that goes to military aid for Israel doesn't go to Israel, it goes to defense contractors in the United States. And one of the things that it does is if the United States has a lull from foreign wars for a while, there's a constant demand for these companies to produce weapons for Israel. So it helps stabilize the arms industry when there's a lull in the United States demand for weapons and military equipment and all of that stuff. To understand Israeli policies increasingly, we have to understand the connections it has with the United States military industrial complex. And that's also very much what's behind the recognition of Israel by the Gulf states, by Saudi Arabia, by these very regressive Arab states that are also dependent on United States arms. So that's part of understanding Israel militarism, is understanding its role within United States imperialism. Which used to not be that was not always the case, but it has been much more in recent years. Remember, in 1967, Israel fought the 67 war with French planes, not American planes, because America was not selling arms to Israel at that time. So everything is developed since the 67 war. It's been uphill for the American military ever since. Isn't America great?
Thanks, Benji.
Benji, I just want to add something to what you said. In Gaza, when we had the different, attacks on Gaza, especially, the airstrikes and the bombing, a lot of these weapons, actually, we believe that they were tried on us. They were tried to experiment, these with these weapons.
Absolutely.
Because when we were looking at the injuries and the types of injuries, in 2008, 2009, thank God we survived, and it was horrible, it was terrible. But the phosphorus bombs, I mean,
White phosphorus.
Yeah, the white phosphorus, though, we even though my mom was asking us to put the wet towels so we don't smell the gas, but eventually when I was looking at at some of the cases of the pregnant women who delivered their babies after they inhaled the gas, the babies were totally deformed. Physically, the babies were deformed. Some of the babies, they came out with with amputated, arms or legs. So some of those injuries also, with the different also types of weapons that they were experimented through time. We had, the other attacks, 2012 too, and 2014, summer 2014. The bone melts, so the doctors were in shock that, some of these cases, they were not sure what to do with the types of injuries. So a lot of it, has to do with the experimenting of these new weapons.
Absolutely.
And then they sell it as battle tested.
Yeah.
And Israeli forces are also stationed all around the world, training other countries. Israel supplies, for example, Modi's government in India. They're a big supplier of that. They're a big arms supplier to the world in general. And they also do training, including the ADL's program for having American police forces trained by the Israeli army, so that these American police forces can use the same tactics in our cities that the Israeli army uses in Gaza.
Exactly.
I don't get that. The army, they sell arms and they buy arms. Are they different, the ones that they sell and they buy? I mean, they're just not. They're big arms suppliers. They're big arms buyer. I mean, I've heard that before. I never quite get it.
Israel doesn't buy that many arms.
I thought we
given
buy
the
arms
arms
to them. I thought
what?
Oh, Or you maybe just give them arms? I mean, they don't
Well,
buy
we
'em.
give them the money to buy the arms.
Right.
And the money never actually leaves the United States. It goes directly to the United States arms manufacturers, and Israel gets shipped the weapons.
Okay, so they ship them weapons and they ship out weapons. Are
Of
they
course.
Yeah.
For a profit. Plus, Israel does have a growing arms industry,
Mhm.
which is, and large part of Israel's economy is based on their military industry,
Right.
Yeah.
which is very much integrated into the American military
Right.
industries. Israel is part of the military industrial complex of
Right.
the United States in a very real sense.
Judy, one of the latest developments is their improvement in drones, armed drones, and drones for spying. I do believe that they made something about the size of a bee that can, fly into houses and stuff like that and perch and
Oh, Israel did this. Israel's got the little mini drone.
Yeah.
And they-
Okay, it's 9:01. So I think I want to call this meeting to a close. I want to thank Jeff. And I want to thank all the people who came. I want to remind the people who came that on June 20th, not June 6th, as it says here, but on June 20th at 7 o'clock, Mirzad Burgadi will give an analysis of the Iran nuclear deal, prospects for renewal, consequences of success and failure. Also, I'll be sending out a link to the recording of this. So those people who are not on my mailing list who want the recording, please send an email to info@LAJewsforpeace.org. That's LAJewsforpeace.org. info@LAJewsforpeace.org, and I will make sure you get a copy of the link to the recording. And if anyone wants to be on our mailing list for future Zooms, send it to that same email address.
I want to thank all of my friends for your support. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Way to go, Jeff. And goodbye to
Yeah, thanks, Jeff.
folks. Vicky, Randy, David Mandel,
See you, Yasmin.
Shashin,
And I,
Yasmin, nice to meet you.
Bye. Nice to meet
Great
you.
job.
Bye, Norberta.
Great.
Hi.
Great job, Jeff. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thanks so
Jeff.
much.
Thanks, Jeff, very much.
take care. Thank you.
Thanks,
Okay. Bye, Dick.
Aya, my love to your mother.
Bye, Shashin.
Thank you
I think
so
she's
much.
gone. Oh, she's still there.
She's still down there at the bottom. Yeah.
And my wife said, I don't remember her. So I love my wife and thank you, my wife.
Bye-bye, everybody.